Dr. Sarah Chin pressed her palms against the cold metal railing of the CDC observation deck, watching the city lights flicker below like dying stars. The emergency broadcast had gone out 3 hours ago, but she knew it was already too late. The pathogen they'd been tracking for weeks had mutated beyond their worst projections, and now Atlanta was ground zero for something that defied every scientific model they'd created. Her secure phone buzzed with another incoming report from field teams scattered across the metropolitan area, each message painting a grimmer picture than the last. Infection rate is exponential, she whispered to herself, reviewing the data streaming across her tablet. The numbers were staggering. What had started as isolated incidents in the morning had exploded into citywide chaos by evening. The infected weren't just sick, they were transforming into something that retained enough motor function to be mobile but had lost all higher cognitive abilities. Worse still, they exhibited an inexplicable aggression toward uninfected humans, as if driven by some primal instinct to spread their condition. Across town, Marcus Rivera crouched behind an overturned delivery truck, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation unfolding on Peachtree Street. The former Army sergeant had been visiting his sister when the emergency alerts started blaring from every phone, radio, and television in the city. Now, less than 6 hours later, he found himself leading a group of 17 survivors through streets that had become a nightmare landscape. The infected moved differently than he'd expected, not shambling like in movies, but with a jerky, purposeful gait that suggested they retained enough coordination to be genuinely dangerous. "Stay low and keep moving," he whispered to Elena Vasquez, the emergency room nurse who had become his unofficial second-in-command. She nodded grimly, her medical training evident in how she'd been triaging the group's minor injuries while they moved. Behind them, the diverse group of survivors included a software engineer named David Park who had been working late at his downtown office, retired teacher Mrs. Patterson who had been visiting her granddaughter, and Tony Mitchell, a city bus driver who had abandoned his route to help evacuate passengers when the chaos began. The infected were learning, Marcus realized with growing unease. The first wave had been chaotic and disorganized, but as the hours passed, they began displaying pack-like behavior. They seemed to communicate through a series of guttural sounds and gestures, coordinating their movements in ways that suggested some form of collective intelligence was emerging from their individual madness. This wasn't random violence, it was strategic hunting. Dr. Chen's team at the CDC had identified the same troubling pattern. The infected retained enough cognitive function to use tools, open doors, and even solve simple problems. They showed preference for attacking in groups, overwhelming individual targets through sheer numbers rather than brute force. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be adapting their tactics based on human defensive responses, learning from each encounter and modifying their approach accordingly. "We need to get to the interstate," Marcus told his group, studying the route on a paper map he'd taken from an abandoned gas station. Electronic devices were becoming unreliable as cell towers went offline and power grids failed throughout the city. "The evacuation centers are compromised, but if we can reach the military checkpoint at the county line, we might have a chance." Elena checked her watch. It was already past midnight. They'd been moving for 8 hours and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll on everyone. The elderly Mrs. Patterson was struggling to keep pace, while David's laptop bag had proven both a blessing and a curse. It contained potentially valuable information about the city's infrastructure, but it was also slowing him down. Tony had proven invaluable with his knowledge of alternate routes through the city, but even he was starting to show signs of strain. The sound of breaking glass echoed from a nearby office building, followed by the unmistakable chorus of infected voices calling to each other. Marcus counted at least 20 distinct sounds, which meant their group was severely outnumbered. But humans had advantages the infected lacked: the ability to plan, to use complex tools, and most importantly, to work together using sophisticated communication and strategy. "They're getting organized," Elena observed, watching shadows move behind the broken windows. "But so are we." Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the emergency radio frequency, broadcasting updates to any survivors still listening. Her team had made a breakthrough in understanding the pathogen's behavior, but the cure was still theoretical. For now, survival depended on human ingenuity, cooperation, and the hope that intelligence would prove stronger than instinct in the battle for Atlanta's future. The night was far from over, and the real test was just beginning. The silence that followed the breaking glass lasted exactly 43 seconds before Marcus heard the first footstep on concrete. His military training had taught him to count during moments of crisis, And right now those numbers were telling him they had less than 2 minutes before the infected located their position behind the overturned delivery truck. He gestured sharply to Elena, who immediately began moving the group toward the alley he'd identified as their primary escape route. "Single file, maintain visual contact with the person in front of you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the authority that made people listen without question. David clutched his laptop bag closer, the LED status lights now covered with electrical tape after Marcus's stern warning about light discipline. Mrs. Patterson moved with surprising agility for her age, her decades of managing unruly classrooms having apparently prepared her for following instructions under pressure. The infected were communicating more frequently now, their guttural calls echoing between the buildings like some primitive language. Marcus counted at least 30 distinct voices, which meant their small group was facing odds of nearly 2 to 1. But numbers weren't everything. The infected still relied primarily on sight and sound to hunt, while humans could use planning, misdirection, and environmental advantages to level the playing field. "They're tracking us," Elena observed, noticing how the infected voices seemed to be moving in a coordinated pattern. "Not randomly searching, actually following our route." Marcus nodded grimly. The infected had retained enough cognitive function to follow trails, but they hadn't yet learned to predict human behavior or set traps. That gave his group a crucial advantage, but only if they could stay ahead of the learning curve. He'd seen this pattern before in asymmetrical warfare. The moment an enemy started adapting to your tactics, you had to evolve faster or risk being overwhelmed. 20 blocks away, Dr. Chin stood before a wall of monitors displaying real-time data from the few remaining surveillance cameras scattered throughout the city. The CDC's Emergency Command Center had become a fortress of scientific analysis, with her team working around the clock to understand the pathogen's behavioral patterns. What they discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The infected were developing a form of collective intelligence that grew stronger as their numbers increased. "Look at this clustering pattern," her colleague Dr. Williams pointed to a screen showing heat signatures moving through downtown. "They're not just hunting randomly. They're establishing territory, creating search grids, and leaving markers for other groups to follow." The implications were staggering. If the infected could coordinate across multiple groups, they could potentially corner and overwhelm any human survivors who relied on traditional evasion tactics. Dr. Chin immediately reached for her radio, hoping to contact any survivor groups still monitoring emergency frequencies. "This is CDC Atlanta to any survivors on this frequency," she broadcast. "The infected are demonstrating coordinated hunting behavior. Avoid predictable movement patterns and be aware that they may be marking your previous locations." Marcus's radio crackled with the transmission just as his group reached the mouth of the alley. He held up a closed fist, bringing everyone to an immediate stop while he processed the information. Coordinated hunting meant they couldn't simply outrun the infected. They needed to start thinking like prey animals who had survived by being unpredictable. "Change of plans," he announced quietly. "We're going to use the old shell game principle. Tony, I need you to identify 3 different routes to the interstate. We're going to split into smaller groups, take different paths, and reunite at a predetermined location." Elena immediately saw the tactical advantage. Smaller groups move faster and make less noise. If one group gets tracked, the others can still escape. David looked uncertain about separating from the larger group, but Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by volunteering to lead one of the smaller teams. "I've been managing groups of people for 40 years, she said with quiet confidence. "I know how to keep people moving in the right direction." The infected sounds were getting closer, and Marcus could see shadows moving between the buildings behind them. But he also noticed something else. The infected were moving in a pattern that suggested they were trying to surround the area rather than simply chase. They were learning to think tactically, which meant the survivors needed to start thinking strategically. Team 1, Tony and David, take the eastern route through the commercial district. Team 2, Mrs. Patterson and the Johnson family, northern route through the residential area. Team 3, Elena and I will take the southern route with the remaining survivors, Marcus outlined quickly. "We meet at the abandoned shopping mall on Highway 85 in 4 hours. If anyone doesn't make it to the rendezvous, the others continue to the military checkpoint." As they prepared to split up, Elena grabbed Marcus's arm. "What if we're wrong about their intelligence level? What if they're smarter than we think?" Marcus looked back toward the sounds of the approaching infected, then at the determined faces of their fellow survivors. "Then we'll have to get smarter faster. Human intelligence isn't just about individual brilliance. It's about adaptation, cooperation, and learning from each other. That's something they can't replicate." The three groups disappeared into the Atlanta night, each carrying the hope that human ingenuity would prove stronger than infected instinct. The abandoned Peachtree Center MARTA station felt like descending into another world. Marcus and Elena's group had made it to the subway entrance after a harrowing journey through downtown Atlanta, where they'd witnessed the infected demonstrating increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques. The underground offered protection from the chaos above, but it also presented new challenges that none of them had anticipated. The emergency lighting is still functioning, Elena observed, her voice echoing slightly in the tiled corridors. The backup power systems had kept minimal illumination throughout the tunnel network, creating pools of dim light connected by stretches of shadow. It was enough to navigate by, but also enough to potentially reveal their location to anything else that might be using the underground passages. David's technical expertise proved invaluable as they descended deeper into the system. His knowledge of the city's infrastructure layout, combined with subway maps he'd downloaded to his laptop before the cellular networks failed, allowed him to identify potential routes that could take them across the city without surfacing. But as they moved through the first tunnel, they discovered they weren't the only ones who had thought of using the underground. "There's someone ahead," Marcus whispered, hearing the distant sound of human voices echoing through the tunnels. He held up his hand, bringing the group to a halt while he tried to determine whether the voices belonged to survivors or something else. The acoustics of the subway system made it difficult to judge distance or direction, but the cadence of the conversation sounded distinctly human. As they approached cautiously, they encountered a group of 12 survivors who had established a temporary camp in one of the wider station platforms. Led by a former transit authority supervisor named Janet Mills, they had been using the tunnel system for the past several hours, gathering other survivors and attempting to establish communication with the outside world. "We've been monitoring the emergency frequencies," Janet explained, showing them a battery-powered radio setup she'd assembled from equipment found in a maintenance room. "There are at least 6 other groups using the tunnels, maybe more. We're trying to coordinate movement so we don't all end up in the same dead end if the infected figure out we're down here." The relief of finding other organized survivors was tempered by a troubling discovery. David's laptop, when connected to Janet's radio equipment, picked up electronic signals that suggested the infected were beginning to explore the tunnel system. The pattern of sounds detected through the subway's acoustic monitoring system indicated that small groups of infected had entered the tunnels at multiple points throughout the city. "They're not just wandering down here randomly," David analyzed, studying the data patterns on his screen. "Look at these entry points, they're systematic, almost like they're conducting reconnaissance." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "They're learning to use the same tactics we are. If they understand that we're using the tunnels, they'll start adapting their hunting strategies accordingly." The implications became clear as Janet's radio crackled with a transmission from another survivor group. "This is Team 7, we're trapped in the 5-point station. They came down through multiple entrances, cutting off our escape routes. We count at least 20 infected, and they're working together to surround us." Marcus immediately began formulating a rescue plan, but Janet grabbed his arm. "We've lost contact with 3 groups already tonight. Each time the infected seem to know exactly where to find them. Someone's been giving away positions." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Elena looked around at the faces of their combined group, trying to identify who might be compromising their safety. The thought that someone among them might be working with the infected, either voluntarily or under some form of mental influence, was almost too horrifying to consider. David's computer chimed with an incoming message through the emergency network. The communication was brief but devastating. "This is Dr. Chen at CDC Atlanta. We have evidence that some infected individuals are retaining enough cognitive function to use electronic devices. They may be monitoring our communications and using them to track survivor locations." The underground network that had seemed like their salvation suddenly felt like a trap. The infected weren't just adapting to human tactics. They were actively using human technology and communication methods against them. Every radio transmission, every electronic device, every attempt to coordinate with other survivors might be providing the infected with the information they needed to hunt more effectively. "We need to assume they're listening to everything," Marcus decided. "From now on, we communicate through predetermined signals and coded messages only. No more radio chatter, no more electronic devices unless absolutely necessary." Janet nodded grimly. "The tunnel system is still our best option for moving across the city, but we need to treat it like hostile territory. Small groups, constant movement, and no predictable patterns." As if to emphasize her point, the distant sound of infected voices began echoing through the tunnels, growing closer with each passing moment. The underground network had become a three-dimensional chess game where human intelligence was pitted against an enemy that was learning to think like prey while retaining the instincts of a predator. The hunt was moving underground, and the rules were changing faster than anyone could adapt. The Central Atlanta Library had always been a symbol of human knowledge and civilization, but now it represented something far more precious. A fortress where intelligence could be both weapon and shield. Marcus surveyed the massive building from across the street, noting the strategic advantages it offered. Multiple floors provided vertical escape routes, thick walls would muffle sounds, and the extensive collection of books and resources might contain crucial information about the pathogen or survival strategies. "It's perfect," Elena whispered, crouched beside him in the shadows of a burned-out coffee shop. Multiple entrances and exits, plenty of supplies, and if David's right about the infected avoiding large concentrations of paper and ink, the smell might actually help mask our presence. Their combined group had grown to 23 survivors after linking up with Janet's team and 2 other small groups they'd encountered in the tunnels. The library represented their best chance to establish a secure base of operations, but getting everyone inside without alerting the infected patrols would require careful coordination. Mrs. Patterson's teaching experience proved invaluable as they prepared to enter the building. "We need to think about this like a field trip," she suggested, her practical approach cutting through the military jargon. "Clear objectives, assigned roles, and a system for keeping everyone together without losing track of individuals." David had already identified the library's computer systems as a potential goldmine of information. The building's emergency power was still functioning, and the servers contained not just the library's extensive digital collection, but also access to academic databases and research networks that might still be operational. If they could establish a secure connection, they might be able to access CDC research files or communicate with other survivor groups across the country. The infiltration went smoothly, with Tony's knowledge of the building's layout proving crucial. As the city's former library security coordinator, he knew about service entrances and maintenance areas that weren't visible from the street. Within 30 minutes, the entire group had slipped inside through a loading dock that connected to the building's lower level. "This is incredible," David breathed, powering up a bank of computers in the reference section. The library's network is still connected to the internet backbone. Most commercial sites are down, but academic and government servers are still running on backup power. While David worked on establishing secure communications, Mrs. Patterson took charge of organizing the group's resources and establishing a knowledge-sharing system. Her decades of experience managing students and information proved that education was about more than just teaching. It was about creating systems that allowed people to learn from each other efficiently. "We need to document everything we've learned about the infected," she announced, setting up a central information hub using whiteboards and flip charts. "Their behavioral patterns, their weaknesses, their evolution over time. Knowledge is only powerful if it's shared and organized." Elena began cataloging medical supplies they'd gathered, while also researching the pathogen using the library's extensive medical database. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The infection appeared to be a modified version of a naturally occurring parasite, but it had been altered in ways that suggested deliberate genetic manipulation. "Someone created this thing," she reported to the group, her voice tight with anger. "It's not a natural mutation, it's engineered. Which means there might be a way to reverse it, but it also means someone out there knows exactly how it works." Marcus established watch rotations and defensive positions throughout the building, but he was troubled by reports from the other teams. The infected weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They were conducting systematic searches of buildings, and their coordination was becoming increasingly sophisticated. "They're learning about urban warfare," he observed, studying surveillance footage David had pulled from nearby security cameras. "Look at how they're moving, they're using cover, coordinating timing, and even posting sentries. That's not instinctive behavior." The most disturbing discovery came when Mrs. Patterson found research files that had been accessed recently on one of the library's computers. The login timestamps showed that someone had been researching the infected's behavioral patterns just hours before the group's arrival. Either another survivor had been using the library, or the infected had developed the ability to use complex computer systems. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore," Janet observed grimly. "We're fighting for the right to be the dominant intelligent species on this planet." As night fell, the library became a beacon of human knowledge surrounded by an ocean of primitive hunger. The survivors had established their fortress, but they were beginning to realize that their enemy was evolving faster than they had anticipated. The infected weren't just mimicking human behavior, They were developing their own culture, their own strategies, and their own form of intelligence. David's computer chimed with an incoming message from Dr. Chen at the CDC. "We've identified the pathogen's origin," the transmission began. "It's not from Earth." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting infected humans, they were fighting an alien intelligence that was learning to use human bodies as vessels for its own agenda. The stakes had just become planetary, and their small fortress of learning might be humanity's last hope for understanding and defeating an enemy that came from beyond the stars. Outside, the infected began gathering in larger numbers, their calls echoing through the night air with an almost musical quality that suggested they were developing their own form of communication. The siege of the library was about to begin. Dawn broke over Atlanta with an eerie silence that made Marcus more nervous than the infected's nocturnal calls. The library had provided them with one night of relative safety, but their supplies were dangerously low. 23 people required food, water, and medical supplies that the library simply couldn't provide. Elena's medical assessment had identified 3 survivors with injuries that needed immediate attention, and David's analysis of their remaining resources painted a stark picture. They had perhaps 18 hours before malnutrition and dehydration began affecting their decision-making abilities. "The Grady Hospital complex is only 6 blocks away," Elena pointed out, studying the route on a paper map they'd found in the library's reference section. "It's a major medical facility with emergency supplies, pharmaceutical storage, and most importantly, equipment I can use to treat bite victims before the infection spreads." The mention of bite victims sent a chill through the group. 3 of their number had been attacked during the previous night's entry into the library, though the wounds appeared minor. Elena had cleaned and bandaged them, but without proper antibiotics and antiviral medications, there was no way to know if the pathogen had been transmitted through the saliva or blood contact. Marcus studied the hospital layout, his military training automatically calculating approach routes and potential escape paths. "It's a fortress, but it's also a trap. Multiple floors, complex interior layout, and probably packed with infected who were patients or staff when the outbreak hit." Mrs. Patterson had been quietly organizing the survivor groups into functional teams, her teaching experience helping her identify who worked well together and who might be liabilities under pressure. "We need to think about this like a research expedition," she suggested. "Small team, specific objectives, and a clear timeline for return." Tony volunteered immediately, his knowledge of the city's layout making him invaluable for navigation. "I used to drive the hospital route twice a week. I know the service entrances, the loading docks, and the internal corridors. If we're going to do this, we need someone who knows the building." David's technical skills had revealed a troubling development during his overnight analysis of the infected's behavioral patterns. "They're not just coordinating anymore, they're innovating. Look at this surveillance footage from the hospital district." He showed them grainy images of infected individuals using tools, manipulating door handles, and even stacking objects to reach higher floors. "They're learning to solve problems," Elena observed with growing alarm. "That's not just retained muscle memory, that's active problem solving and tool use." The decision to split the team was unanimous but difficult. Marcus would lead the supply run with Elena, Tony, and 4 other survivors, while Mrs. Patterson would coordinate the library's defense with Janet and David. The separation felt like severing a lifeline, but their survival depended on obtaining medical supplies and food before their current resources were exhausted. The journey to Grady Hospital became a masterclass in urban survival. The infected had established territorial markers throughout the city, scratches on walls, arrangements of debris, and even crude symbols that seemed to indicate different groups or hunting areas. Tony's knowledge of the city's service infrastructure allowed them to move through maintenance tunnels and utility corridors that the infected hadn't yet discovered. "They're territorial now," Marcus observed, noting how the infected in different areas displayed distinct behavioral patterns. "The ones near the hospital moved differently than the ones we encountered downtown. They're adapting to their environment." Elena's medical training proved crucial when they finally reached the hospital. The facility was a maze of corridors filled with infected who had been patients, staff, and visitors when the outbreak began. But her knowledge of hospital layout and procedure allowed the team to navigate directly to the pharmacy and emergency supply storage areas. "The bite victims aren't just infected," she discovered, analyzing medical records that were still accessible through the hospital's computer system. "They're being converted into something else. The pathogen is rewriting their neural pathways, but it's also enhancing certain cognitive functions while suppressing others." The supply run became a rescue mission when they discovered a group of survivors barricaded in the hospital's pediatric ward. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon, had been protecting 12 children and 3 adults for nearly 2 days. The decision to expand their rescue mission meant abandoning their original timeline and accepting increased risk. "We can't leave them," Elena insisted, her medical ethics overriding tactical concerns. "Those children won't survive another night without proper protection." The expanded group's escape from the hospital became a running battle through corridors filled with infected who had learned to coordinate their attacks. The infected used the hospital's PA system to communicate, their guttural calls echoing through the building like some alien language. They had learned to cut off escape routes, coordinate timing, and even use the hospital's elevator system to move between floors. Marcus realized with growing horror that the infected weren't just hunting them, they were herding them toward a specific location. The supply run had become a trap, and human intelligence was being outmaneuvered by an alien intelligence that was learning to think like both predator and prey. The real question was whether they could adapt fast enough to survive the return journey to the library, or if their fortress of learning would become their tomb. The return journey to the library became a nightmare of urban warfare as Marcus's expanded team fought their way through streets that had been transformed into hunting grounds. The infected had learned to use the city's infrastructure against them, cutting power lines to create darkness, blocking storm drains to eliminate escape routes, and even manipulating traffic signals to create confusion. But the most disturbing development was their use of sound as a weapon, coordinated howls that echoed between buildings, creating acoustic confusion that made it nearly impossible to determine the direction of approaching threats. "They're jamming our communications," David reported over the radio, his voice crackling with static. The electronic interference had begun shortly after the supply team left the hospital, and it was getting worse with each passing hour. "Something is broadcasting on multiple frequencies, creating enough noise to block our signals." Back at the library, Mrs. Patterson was coordinating the defense with Janet and the remaining survivors, but the loss of communication with Marcus's team was creating panic among the group. Without real-time updates, they had no way of knowing if the supply run had been successful or if their friends were even still alive. "We need to assume they're coming back," Mrs. Patterson announced, her teaching authority helping to calm the growing anxiety. "Our job is to make sure they have something to come back to." Tony's knowledge of the city's layout had kept Marcus's team alive during their escape from the hospital, but the infected seemed to be learning from each encounter. Streets that had been clear hours earlier were now blocked by infected who moved with purpose rather than random wandering. The children they'd rescued were slowing their progress, but Dr. Rodriguez's medical expertise was already proving valuable in treating injuries and managing the group's health. "They're not just blocking our route," Marcus realized as they took shelter in an abandoned fire station. "They're channeling us. Every time we change direction they're there waiting. It's like they know where we're going." Elena's analysis of the bite victims had revealed something terrifying. The pathogen isn't just controlling them, it's networking them. They're sharing information instantaneously, like some kind of biological internet. When one infected individual learns something, they all learn it. The implications were staggering. If the infected could share knowledge across their entire population, then every human tactic, every escape route, every defensive strategy would be known to all of them within hours. The survivors weren't just fighting individual infected. They were fighting a collective intelligence that was growing smarter with each encounter. David's technical analysis from the library confirmed their worst fears. The electronic interference isn't random, it's targeted. They're specifically blocking frequencies used by emergency services, military communications, and amateur radio operators. But they're leaving civilian broadcast frequencies open. "They want us to hear something," Janet realized. "They're controlling information flow, deciding what we can and cannot communicate." The realization that they were being manipulated on a strategic level sent shockwaves through both groups. The infected weren't just hunting them, they were conducting psychological warfare, using humanity's dependence on communication and coordination against them. Mrs. Patterson's decades of managing difficult situations proved invaluable as stress and desperation began taking their toll on the library group. Arguments broke out over resource allocation, with some survivors arguing they should abandon the supply team and focus on their own survival. Others insisted they should attempt a rescue mission, even though they lacked the numbers and equipment to be effective. "We're doing exactly what they want us to do," she observed, watching the group dynamics deteriorate. "They're making us turn against each other. That's not accident, that's strategy." Tony's radio crackled with a brief transmission from Marcus. "Library team, we're 2 blocks out, but we're being herded. The infected are driving us toward the main entrance. It's a trap. The library group had minutes to decide whether to open their fortress to help their friends escape, knowing that doing so would likely compromise their own security. The infected had learned to use human compassion as a weapon, forcing impossible choices between survival and loyalty. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came through the static. We have critical medical supplies and information about the pathogen. The children are safe, but we need immediate extraction. David's computers suddenly blazed to life with incoming data streams. Someone's hacking our systems, he announced. But it's not the infected. It's coming from multiple survivor groups across the country. They're sharing information, coordinating resistance efforts. The electronic interference that had been blocking their communications was suddenly reversed, as if someone had flipped a switch. Clear signals began pouring in from survivor groups in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of smaller cities. The infected's communication jamming had been overcome by a coordinated effort from human settlements across the continent. This is Dr. Chen at CDC Atlanta, came a crystal-clear transmission. We've established a nationwide survivor network. The infected have been jamming local communications, but they haven't learned to block satellite uplinks. We're coordinating a simultaneous counteroffensive across multiple cities. The communication breakdown had become a communication breakthrough, but the real test would be whether human cooperation could overcome the infected's collective intelligence before it was too late to save Atlanta and the rest of humanity. Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the satellite uplink with an urgency that cut through the chaos surrounding the Atlanta library. We've developed a theoretical solution, but it requires precise coordination between survivor groups and access to the city's emergency broadcast system. The pathogen has a critical vulnerability. It can't adapt to multiple simultaneous stimuli that contradict its learning patterns. Marcus pressed himself against the fire station wall as infected surrounded their position, their movements now displaying an almost military precision that spoke to their rapidly evolving intelligence. Elena worked frantically to stabilize one of the children who had been injured during their escape from the hospital, while Dr. Rodriguez coordinated the medical care for their expanded group of survivors. The infected are learning from every encounter, Dr. Chen continued, but their collective intelligence has a fatal flaw. It prioritizes the most recent information over contradictory data from previous experiences. If we can overwhelm their network with conflicting behavioral patterns, we might be able to crash their collective consciousness. David's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard as he processed the incoming data from survivor groups across the country. The plan was audacious in its scope, a coordinated effort to confuse the infected's shared intelligence by presenting them with contradictory information simultaneously. Every survivor group would need to execute different tactics at exactly the same moment, creating a feedback loop that the pathogen's network couldn't resolve. It's like crashing a computer system, David explained to the library group. If you flood a network with more data than it can process, the whole system locks up. But this has to be perfectly timed across multiple cities. Mrs. Patterson immediately grasped the educational implications. We're teaching them the wrong lessons on purpose. Every group presents different information, and their collective intelligence tries to learn from all of it simultaneously. The infected had positioned themselves around the library in a siege formation that demonstrated their growing understanding of military strategy. But Janet's knowledge of the building's infrastructure revealed a potential advantage. The library's emergency broadcast system is still connected to the city's network. If we can access it, we might be able to coordinate not just with other survivor groups, but with the entire metropolitan area. Tony's voice came through the radio with increasing urgency. They're not just surrounding us, they're studying us. I can see them watching our movements, timing our patterns. They're learning how we think. Elena made a critical discovery while treating the bite victims. The pathogen's network connection works both ways. When I apply contradictory medical treatments to infected tissue samples, the response creates confusion in the local infected population. We might be able to use medical intervention as a weapon. The plan that emerged required every member of their group to contribute their unique expertise. Marcus would coordinate the tactical elements, using his military training to create movement patterns that contradicted the infected's expectations. Elena and Dr. Rodriguez would implement medical interventions designed to send confusing signals through the pathogen's biological network. David would manage the technical aspects, synchronizing their efforts with survivor groups across the country through the satellite uplink. Mrs. Patterson's role was perhaps the most crucial. She would coordinate the human elements, ensuring that every survivor understood their part in the complex operation. "This isn't just about survival anymore," she announced to the group. "We're fighting for the right of human intelligence to exist independently." The infected began their final assault on the library just as the nationwide coordination reached critical mass. Survivor groups in dozens of cities simultaneously implemented contradictory tactics. Some groups scattered while others concentrated, some used noise while others maintained silence, some fought aggressively while others retreated. The goal was to create so much conflicting data that the infected's collective intelligence would be unable to process it. "They're stopping," Marcus reported from his position near the library's main entrance. The infected had suddenly halted their coordinated advance, their movements becoming erratic and confused. Some individuals were trying to execute multiple contradictory actions simultaneously, creating a bizarre dance of conflicting behaviors. David's computers showed the pathogen's network beginning to destabilize. "It's working. The collective intelligence is experiencing cascade failures. They can't reconcile the contradictory information they're receiving." But the victory came at a cost. As the infected's collective intelligence collapsed, individual infected began reverting to more primitive behaviors. They became more aggressive, more unpredictable, and in some ways more dangerous than before. The organized siege became a chaotic free-for-all as infected individuals lost their ability to coordinate with each other. "We've broken their network," Elena observed, "but now we're dealing with thousands of individual predators instead of one collective intelligence." Dr. Chen's voice came through the satellite link with both triumph and warning. "The collective intelligence is down across multiple cities, but this is just the first phase. The infected individuals are still dangerous, and we don't know how long the network disruption will last. You need to move to phase 2 immediately." The library group realized that their victory had bought them time, but the real battle for humanity's future was just beginning. They had proven that human intelligence could outthink the infected collective, but now they needed to prove they could outlast individual infected who were no longer bound by the limitations of shared consciousness. The siege was broken, but the war for Atlanta, and for humanity itself, was far from over. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the library's tall windows, illuminating a scene that would have been unimaginable just 24 hours earlier. The infected who had laid siege to their fortress now wandered aimlessly through the streets, their collective intelligence shattered and their coordinated behaviors reduced to primitive impulses. But Marcus knew that this victory, however significant, was only the beginning of humanity's real challenge. "Phase 2 is already underway," Dr. Chin reported through the satellite link, her voice carrying both exhaustion and hope. "Survivor groups across the country are implementing containment protocols. Without their network connection, individual infected can be managed using traditional crowd control and medical intervention techniques." Elena moved through the library's makeshift medical station, treating survivors who had been injured during the night's chaotic battle. The bite victims who had been showing signs of infection were responding to the antiviral treatments she discovered at the hospital, their symptoms stabilizing as the pathogen lost its ability to coordinate its assault on their immune systems. "The pathogen is still present," Dr. Rodriguez observed, analyzing blood samples under a microscope they'd salvaged from the hospital. "But without the collective intelligence directing it, the individual organisms are becoming inactive. It's like they've lost their purpose." David's computers displayed a remarkable transformation taking place across Atlanta and other major cities. The infected individuals were beginning to show signs of cognitive recovery as the alien intelligence's influence weakened. Some were even responding to verbal commands and showing recognition of family members who had survived the outbreak. "They're coming back," Mrs. Patterson said softly, watching through the window as an infected woman stopped her aimless wandering and seemed to notice her surroundings for the first time in days. "Not completely, but they're regaining their humanity." Tony had established communication with survivor groups throughout the metropolitan area, coordinating efforts to secure essential infrastructure and establish safe zones for the recovering infected. His knowledge of the city's layout was proving invaluable for organizing the massive logistical challenge of rebuilding civilization while caring for thousands of people who were slowly recovering from alien possession. The plan that emerged from their collective intelligence was as ambitious as it was necessary. Each survivor group would take responsibility for a specific aspect of the recovery effort. Marcus would coordinate security and protection for the vulnerable recovering individuals. Elena and Dr. Rodriguez would establish medical treatment centers to help the infected regain their cognitive functions. David would work on restoring communication networks and documenting everything they'd learned about the pathogen. Mrs. Patterson's role evolved into something that felt familiar yet profoundly important. She became the coordinator of the re-education effort. These people are going to need to relearn how to be human, she explained. They've been operating under alien influence for days or weeks. We need to help them remember who they were. The most remarkable discovery came when David established contact with similar recovery efforts on other continents. The coordinated disruption of the infected's collective intelligence had been successful globally, but the aftermath was revealing the true scope of what humanity had survived. The pathogen hadn't been a random infection. It had been a systematic attempt to replace human intelligence with something alien and hostile. We weren't just fighting for survival, Dr. Chin explained during a global conference call that connected survivor groups from 6 continents. We were fighting for the right to remain the dominant intelligent species on our own planet. The pathogen was trying to create a new form of life that would have eventually replaced humanity entirely. As the sun climbed higher, Atlanta began to show signs of recovery that went beyond mere survival. The infected who were regaining their consciousness brought with them memories of their time under alien influence, providing crucial intelligence about the pathogen's true nature and objectives. This information would prove invaluable for preventing future outbreaks and developing permanent immunity. Elena discovered that exposure to the pathogen, once overcome, provided natural immunity to reinfection. It's like our immune systems learn to recognize and defeat the alien organisms. The survivors aren't just recovered, they're protected. The library had become more than a fortress of learning. It had become the birthplace of humanity's renaissance. The crisis had forced people to work together in ways that transcended traditional boundaries, combining individual expertise into collective intelligence that had proven superior to even an alien hive mind. Marcus stood on the library's roof, watching as people emerged from hiding places throughout the city. Some were survivors who had weathered the storm, others were recovered infected who were slowly remembering their humanity. All of them were living proof that human intelligence, when properly coordinated, could overcome any challenge. We didn't just outlast the night, he said into his radio, broadcasting to survivor groups across the globe. We outlasted extinction. Human intelligence, human cooperation, and human determination have won the right for our species to continue evolving on our own terms. The dawn of a new day had become the dawn of humanity's next chapter, written by people who had proven that intelligence, courage, and cooperation were the most powerful forces in the universe. The infected had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by the uniquely human ability to learn, adapt, and work together toward a common goal. The night was over and humanity had emerged stronger than ever before.